This is our new Patreon series number 8, part 1. We're going to look at a form of mystic ascent, of ecstatic meditation that was very common among mystic Jews of the Hellenistic period, and for which there's a lot of evidence that Yeshua and his apostles and disciples probably used. It's called Merkabah mysticism. And we're going to look at the Merkabah ascent and apocalyptic gnosis in early Christianity. This is part 1. So we have to learn about the history and the development of Merkabah visions and prophetic meditation in Jewish religion and Jewish mysticism. Before the exile, before the Babylonian captivity, in the 6th century, before the Christian era, we have various legends about contacts of prophets and other people with heaven and with God, and ascent to the throne of God. Yahweh was originally thought to dwell on mountaintops and in the sky. So if we look at the pre-exilic Hebrew day and night Shemayim, or heavens, they might look sort of like this. Underneath the earth is Sheol, where people go after they die. And above, somehow, transcendentally above the earth, possibly in the sky, is Godhead. And that's the way it was looked at before the contact with Zoroastrian religion and astronomy and astrology and sky religion, as it developed and became very important in Hebrew mysticism. So prophetic visions and dreams were delivered in the past tense, not the future tense. And that was the way it continued all the way through the time of Yeshua's Galilean form of Pharisaic religion. That was known as the propheticus perfectus tense. So when a prophet foretold the future, so to speak, what he was doing is seeing what was already prepared in the heavens, what already existed in the causal worlds, or the world of Yetzirah, the world of formation, that would of necessity eventually manifest on earth. So he said, already in the heavens, I see this fate occurring for Jerusalem, and I see this and that, and it's all a response to the causes that have been created by human activities on earth, and the negative consequences, which were known as hub, or the consequences of sin, would inevitably manifest. And that's how prophetic predictions were made. But they were in the past tense, and so they were always said, I saw this happening, and I saw this happened, and so and so. There was no future tense in Hebrew to express a future time. Only in the Greek New Testament do we have a future. So in the case of Isaiah, the great prophet, he had a vision or a dream in what we might call the night heavens. There were 2 Shemayim above the firmament. There were no series of heavens at that time. And his vision was that of being elevated to the throne of God and being purified. Here in this drawing, you see an angel putting hot coals on his lips to purify him, to make him worthy to speak the message of God, because the prophet received the message directly from Godhead and the throne of God, and therefore he had to be purified in order to even be in that presence. We also have legends at the pre-exilic time that were written into the Pentateuch and so on, of Jacob's dream of the stairs. The Hebrew word is sulam, with angels ascending and descending from the heavens. So there was another form of contact between heaven and earth, that the heavens are somehow up in the sky, and the angels can descend and appear on earth and appear as normal human beings. Jacob, of course, wrestled with an angel, and that's how the name Israel came about, which is the one who struggles with God. Elijah, we are told, when he did his form of contemplation or meditation to end the drought in Israel, he was on the mountain with his head between his knees. Now, this little picture I put up isn't really your head between your knees, but it's as close as I can come to that. And that was a posture for doing a special form of meditation or concentration. Was known as SHAQAD, or as watching, keeping watch. It's a single-pointed form of meditation where one focuses and concentrates on one thing. And then we are told from other pre-exilic legends that Enoch and Elijah also both were assumed bodily into heaven. Elijah was made his trip into heaven in a Merkabah, a chariot. Merkabah is a form of transportation, especially for a war general. It's a chariot with wheels, but this is a flaming chariot that goes up into the sky to ascend to the heavenly places. So now, in the post-exilic period, after the 6th century BC, when the Jewish priests were exposed to the ideas and the philosophy of the Zoroastrians, who had explored the heavens and come up with theories about the different forms of heavens and the different types of heavens, so to speak, the Shemayim. At this point is when Merkabah mysticism began to develop. And it is there in Babylon that Ezekiel has his vision of Yahweh on his throne chariot, his Merkabah, and that becomes the mandala that's used by those who are riders of the chariot, those who make this very highly stylized map of consciousness and use it as a means of ascending in consciousness to Godhead. So let's take a look at the Merkabah ascent, the throne chariot ascent of vision of Ezekiel. So this is occurring in Babylon during the captivity. Ezekiel is exposed to and understands and is and his vision is imbued with the kind of art and architecture you would find on Near Eastern temples, the kind that that made up the art and architecture of the Temple of Solomon, and would later be incorporated in the New Temple. So Ezekiel's account uses the same imagery as found in Near Eastern, Egyptian, and Solomonic temples. I'm showing you one artist's view of the of a priest standing before the cherubim, the sacred animals that guard the throne of God. So the chariot throne of Merkabah had wheels like that used by a king in battle as his traveling war throne. The significance in the allegorical vision of Ezekiel is divine omniscience. Yahweh is mobile. He's omniscient. He's omnipotent. He can be everywhere at once. So that's what the significance of the Merkabah is, the traveling wheels and so on. The chariot throne of Merkabah was made of many angels being driven by, quote, the likeness of a man, who is Yahweh, who looks like a human being. And we have to understand that from the earliest times, the concept of the primal man, or Godhead as a primal anthropos, actually existed in Jewish mysticism, and came out much later in things like Sethian Gnosticism and other forms that we're going to talk about later. So 4 angels form the basic structure of the Merkabah. These angels are called the CHARIOT, the living creatures. The bodies of the Chayot are like that of a human being, but each of them has 4 faces corresponding to the 4 directions a chariot can go, north, east, south, and west. And the faces are that of a man, a lion, an ox, which later is changed to a child or a cherub, and an eagle. And since there are 4 angels and each has 4 faces, there are a total of 16 faces. Now, where have we heard of the faces of a man, lion, and an ox, and an eagle? Well, that's the way the 4 Gospels were in the 2nd, 3rd century described and are symbolized later. So the symbolism of the cherubim, it was very powerful and was kept in both Jewish and Christian mystic tradition. The angel face of a man is always on the east side and looks up at the likeness of a man, or Yahweh, that drives the chariot. Let's look at some of the imagery that Ezekiel describes in addition to these things. Each Chayot, or angel, has 4 wings and hooves, and they create a sort of box of wings that form the perimeter of the chariot. With the remaining 2 wings, each angel covered its own body. Below, but not attached to the feet of the Chayot angels, are other angels that are shaped like wheels. These wheel angels, are described as wheels within wheels, are called ophanim. Wheels, cycles, or ways. These wheels are not directly under the chariot, but are nearby and along its perimeter. Each wheel is full of eyes, representing consciousness. Divine omniscience. Godhead knows and sees all things at all times. So the likeness of a man sits on a throne seat made of sapphire, and in this picture, it's very difficult for an artist to draw all these things that are in the vision of Ezekiel. They're very bizarre, but this is one artist's attempt to render this concept of Isaiah's vision. Now, Isaiah's vision becomes the first standard map of consciousness for those who mystics who undertake the ascent to the throne of God through the work of the Merkabah. So if we look at the evolution of this Merkabah mysticism, the riders of the chariot are doing what are called the Ma'asa Merkabah, the work of the chariot. And they do so in order to learn the secrets, the Ratzim, of God, the secrets of the heavens. Very often they're about political things, or they're about esoteric things. In Palestine and Babylon, we find the apocalyptic schools that were associated with the perfect human, Enoch, who had ascended into heaven bodily, and there was no traces of his bones left on earth. And in the Enochian form, we find that the prophet makes an ascent with a great angel and or a chariot, using the Babylonian and Greek astrological models of 7 to 10 heavens. And they go past a great sea, which probably represents the sky itself. And they make an ascent. Here it looks like a descent, but we're going from the 1st to the 2nd to the 3rd, all the way to the 10th heaven of Aravot. And this is how the ascent is made. Through each of these levels, there are things that are seen, there are guardians at each level, and so on. We've discussed this in other presentations. So, in the wisdom schools of Alexandria and Palestine and Babylon, the meditation techniques and contemplation of Ezekiel's Merkabah images becomes becomes a project that is done by certain proto-rabbis and mystics and so on. It's done in nighttime, in the night heaven ascent, in the chariot, which is the Merkabah, which is part of a visioning process. First century rabbinic school of Akiba in Palestine developed forms of Merkabah ascent. They contemplated Ezekiel's Merkabah images in the Great Sea and added to that the Hekaloth, or hallways, to the palace of Yahweh. And as we get into 2nd to 4th centuries, the Merkabah mysticism develops into Hekaloth mysticism. The ascent becomes much more complicated. There are more hallways to go through to get to the throne of God, etc. So this is contemplation using Akiba's method, but with greater and detailed elaboration of the heavenly palace and its hallways. So this is how the work of the chariot developed over a period of maybe 800, 700 years. We have Talmudic accounts from the 1st century of the concept of Merkabah mysticism and how it was done, how it was practiced. It could only be taught to those who had already discovered it. It was not something that was talked about. It was, in fact, against all the rules of Hebrew mystic culture and the wisdom schools to ever speak about this. It is something that had to be discovered for himself by a Talmud or a disciple. So here we have one quotation taken from a Talmudic account that gives us an idea of how this might have proceeded. Subsequently, 2 other disciples of Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, walking together, said to each other, "Let us also talk together about the Ma'aseh Merkabah." And no sooner did Rabbi Yeshua, this is not our Yeshua, this is another rabbi named Yeshua, begin speaking, than a rainbow-like appearance, that refers back to Ezekiel 128, was seen upon the thick clouds which covered the sky, and angels came to listen as men do to hear wedding music. Now notice the relationship to marriage and a wedding banquet all becomes part of the Messianic Merkabah language. On hearing the things related by Rabbi Joseph, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai blessed his disciples and said, "Blessed are the eyes that beheld these things. Indeed, I saw myself in a dream, together with you, seated like the select ones." Again, you can compare that to Ezekiel 24:11. "Upon Mount Sinai, and I heard a heavenly voice saying, 'Enter the banquet hall and take your seats with your disciples and disciples' disciples among the elect, the highest or 3rd class.'" These are those who are advanced enough to be worthy of receiving this kind of revelation. Notice again, this is all Messianic banquet language that we find in the teachings of Yeshua. The wedding banquet, the elect, the marriage of heaven and earth, and so on. So in Tosefta Hagiga 2, 3, and 4, it says, 4 entered the orchard, the Pardes. That would be in the 3rd heaven, where one would receive instruction from heaven, heavenly angels. That's where Paul was said he ascended to. 4 entered the Pardes: Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiba. 1 peaked and died, 1 peaked and was smitten, 1 peaked and cut down the shoots, 1 ascended safely and descended safely. What that means is to peak is to get a glimpse of and to hear heavenly things that no person could fathom or understand on earth. One so one person had the experience and died. He was smitten. One peeked and cut down the shoots. That means he became a heretic. One died, and one was smitten, means one became permanently injured. One peeked and cut down the shoots, became a heretic, and one ascended safely and descended safely. That, of course, would be Rabbi Akiba, who was pure enough to make the ascent and the return. So it was thought that this was a very, 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 very dangerous thing. Only a very pure person could safely make this ascent and descent. There was a great danger of insanity or of death. So now let's look at the concept of MISHQAD or SHAQAD, which is translated as a watch. It's a form of single-pointed Merkabah meditation. And there's evidence that Yeshua instructed his disciples in a secret form of Jewish prophetic meditation called SHAQAD, keeping watch. MISHQAD was a means of Jewish Merkabah ascent through the heavens, achieved through what Buddhists describe as calm abiding and single-pointed focus. The goal was to learn the Ratzim HaMalkuth HaShemayim, the secret knowledge of the sovereignty of the heavens. This is translated in the New Testament Greek as the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, which Yeshua is said to have imparted to his disciples. The so-called transfiguration event was a SHAQAD. It was a form of single-pointed meditation. It was probably a form of Merkabah ascent. Because why? Because they have achieved ascent into the third heaven, where the living prophets could make contact in the Pardes, in the paradise, with Yeshua and with other prophets, and as Paul claimed. The three disciples with whom Yeshua shared the so-called transfiguration experience were all given initiatic names. Shimon was called Kephas, which means rock or stone, which translated into Greek becomes Petros, and now we know him as Peter. That's his initiatic name. So Kephas and the two brothers, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were given the name of Boanerges, which means voice, powerful voice like an ox. This was apparently an all-night, one-to-one initiation that Yeshua communicated to an advanced Talmud or disciple. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene describes an ascent that goes beyond the third heaven, and this is something that only Mary Magdalene was worthy enough to receive, according to this, and the others had not. Magdalene, Magdala, was probably an initiatic name. People have tried to connect it to a town that may or may not have existed called Magdala, which means tower. But probably Mary Magdala is an initiatic name that means tower of strength. That's how she is represented, by the way, in the earliest Eastern Orthodox legends and traditions and images. So the Transfiguration event seems to have been a SHAQAD. In Luke's account, the following important details suggest that it was a Merkabah MISHQAD event. Peter and his companions were drowsy. I've underlined that because part of the experience of single-pointed meditation is to be fighting against drowsiness. But when they became fully awake, and that is what the final result of this kind of single-pointed meditation, they saw Yeshua's glory, or kavod, the splendor and light surrounding the throne of Godhead, and two men standing with them, which they assumed to be Moses and Elijah. A cloud appeared, in the surrounding the throne of God is the Anan, Kabbalistic veils of primordial light that hide the face of Godhead. And a voice came out of the cloud, and this is, by the way, the only way people and prophets experience Godhead other than seeing God as an ancient of days or an old man, is very strong light and a voice. This is what the experience of Paul was when on the road to Damascus. When he says he saw or heard the voice of Christ, he saw a very bright light and heard a voice. That's all the experience consisted of. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my best one, my Bachar, my chosen, tested, approved, beloved one. Listen to him." So that's one account, the fullest account we have of this legend. So Peter with James and John, quote, became fully awake, and in that state of SHAQAD they experienced the vision of the divine Olam, the world of God, and the Jewish saints of the Kima, the continuity of consciousness after death in the third heaven. Now let's take a look at the New Testament gospel, which is written several generations after the execution of Yeshua. It's written in an entirely different language, Greek, which does misunderstand the Aramaic quite badly. And it's written in an entirely different culture by either Hellenistic Jews or just Gentiles. And so very often an awful lot of what they transmit is not understood by them very well. And one of them is the admonitions to watch. In the New Testament he says, "What I say unto you, I say unto all, watch," and all these other watch commands that you find. The Aramaic word mishqad, spiritual contemplation, is the root of the New Testament Greek verb gregorein, which means to watch, which is used in the New Testament. But in Jewish Hellenistic usage, this Greek verb always translates Aramaic and Hebrew shaqad, meaning to vigil, to meditate, contemplate, keep spiritual watch. It's a vigil. And this is what they were doing in the Transfiguration. In later New Testament gospel interpretation, it meant watch for the end of the world or the second coming, neither of which were teachings of Yeshua. They were teachings of Paul and other people who taught Christianity as a religion about the deity Jesus rather than a faithful transmission of the teachings of the sage and prophet Yeshua. But Yeshua wasn't teaching about the later Christian idea of the end of the world. He taught the coming of the Messianic age through sanctification and transformation of the earth by the spiritually reborn saints of the Baranash, or new humanity. So historically, his exhortations to watch were parallel to his exhortations to always pray. So he was probably advocating a form of divine Merkabah vigil that was lost or misunderstood in the later Greek-speaking Gentile churches who actually refused to follow the teachings that were given by the original apostles and disciples, and instead based much of their concepts on the interpretations of Paul, who had never known or seen or been a student of Yeshua, and who had, and in his own epistles very clearly states that he did not receive instruction from the apostles, but from his own revelations. So SHAQAD seems to have survived in proto-Orthodox Christianity as the traditional Christian Saturday all-night Easter vigil and the legends of the ascension of Jesus into heaven and so on. But mystic ascent into the heavens characterized many second-century Gnostic apocalypses. And of course, we will be talking about Paul's Merkabah ascent. And this tradition was continued perhaps more authentically through Gnostic traditions that claimed to have the secret traditions of Yeshua than it was in proto-Orthodox Christianity. So the initiatic Merkabah techniques of Yeshua were conflated in their understanding with Hermetic and Neoplatonic forms and transmitted in literary revelations of the Gnostics. We will look at more carefully in part 2 of this presentation. So here are some of the things that imply this form of meditation in Merkabah ascent in order to learn the secrets, the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, so to speak. The Transfiguration, it's an initiatic experience for James, John, and Peter. The Ascension of Jesus, a persistent legend that Jesus ascended into heaven after 40 days. The Basor that was preached by Yeshua, which is not the gospel of Christianity, but the Basor, implies that he had received a message for Israel, a public message for Israel, directly from the throne or Merkabah of Yahweh, as all the other prophets had done. And thus Yeshua was assumed to have ascended to the throne of God like other prophets to receive the message. We know also have accounts of Yeshua's solitary retreats into the wilderness for seclusion. And this implies that he had private practices of vigil and SHAQAD. And there are several sayings in the Gospels of Jesus, the Jesus of the Christians, exhorting his disciples to watch. And in Aramaic would be to keep MISHQAD, to keep vigil, having nothing to do with watching for the end of the world or the second coming. And we have the all-night one-to-one transmission and initiation into the Ratsim of the Malkuth, the mysteries of the sovereignty, which is badly translated as the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven in the Greek Gospels. We have that described in the secret Gospel of Mark, which is also very early 1st century. So these are some of the ways this is implied in the early Jesus legends. So we have now some other ways that ascension and Merkabah visions are implied in early Christian legends and tradition. We have Paul's Merkabah ascent to the third heaven of paradise, which equates to the Enochian ascent through the heavens. And we know that Enoch was a sacred scripture quoted in the New Testament. In the Epistle of Jude quotes from the book of Enoch as though it were sacred scripture, which did not come down as anything but pseudepigrapha and apocrypha later in Christianity, but at that time it was considered to be sacred literature. We have the Ebionite Ascents of James, very early Jewish Christian apocalypse that describes the brother of Yeshua making this kind of an ascent into the heavens. We have the Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter, which preserves traditions about Peter ascending into the heavens to receive revelations. We have the persistence of Merkabah ascent accounts attributed to the disciples of Yeshua in 2nd century Christian literature, like the Apocalypse of Peter. And even though these do not have a direct line of apostolic lineage back to Yeshua, they do imply the persistence of these Merkabah ascension accounts. They're very often brought forward as revelatory appearances of Christ as he appeared to Paul to receive revelations, private revelations, as Paul claimed to have received. We have the legends of the Assumption or Ascension into the heavens of the Virgin Mary after death. And by the way, those kinds of legends go on later when forms of Jewish Christicism and Gnostic Christianity, rather, are transmitted to Muhammad in Islam, and then we have the later legends of the ascent of Muhammad into the heavens, by the way. We have the Christian contemplative tradition that developed in the Egyptian desert in the 3rd and 4th centuries, known as Hitboded meditation. It was a Merkabah form of meditation. And we have a connection to the Merkabah ascent of Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of Mary, which we've discussed much more fully in a whole presentation on that. And in early Greek iconography, Mary Magdalene is always depicted preaching the ascension of Yeshua, the ascension of Yeshua into the heavens. And the legends of Mary Magdalene are always about her making daily ascents into the heavens, guided by angels, and subsisting on nothing but the sacred Eucharist. Mary experienced her own ascent into the heavens daily, according to early legends, and God's angels came down 7 times a day and transported her up to where she could hear the celestial music of heaven, and then carried her back to her grotto carved in the rock. So these are the legends of the ascents into heaven that start from the earliest recordings and records we have of teachings of Yeshua, and they persist for centuries. So now let's take a look at what Paul says about his ascent into the 3rd heaven in 2 Corinthians 12, 1-6. Paul is defending his claim to be an apostle, even though he had never been a disciple of Yeshua and was in fact in conflict with Peter and James and other apostles. Apparently, the having secret Merkabah experience was considered to be evidence of initiation and apostleship, as it was in the later Gnostic revelations. And so he uses his claim of an ascent to the 3rd heaven, the Pardes, the paradise of the 3rd heaven, Enoch's 3rd heaven, as evidence that he, just like James and Peter and John, had been taken to the 3rd heaven and received revelations that were too sublime to reveal. So in his defense of his apostleship, Paul says in 2 Corinthians, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Now he says, I know a man. He doesn't say I, because among the practitioners of Merkabah mysticism in Judaism, and among the Hebrew mystics and the wisdom schools and the proto-rabbis and later the rabbis, it was absolutely verboten to speak of your own experiences in this way. And you could only speak with a master of this when you had discovered it yourself, had received it individually yourself. So he says, I know a man in Christ who was taken up, etc. So the 3rd heaven, by the way, would be the place where James, John, and Peter saw Moses and Elijah speaking with Jesus in the Jesus legends. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to the 3rd heaven of paradise. And in the Enochian scheme of the 10 heavens used by Yeshua and his disciples, both the Pardes, paradise, and Gehenna, purgatory, existed in the 3rd heaven, on the east of Eden and the west of Eden, and so on. He, meaning I, Paul, heard inexpressible things that man is not permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weaknesses. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. So here's Paul defending his claims to be an apostle. He's had the same initiatic experience as Peter, James, and Paul, and probably Mary Magdalene. So if we want to look at what is a probable tradition of the Merkabah ascent that was passed on by Yeshua to his apostles and his disciples, and that was kept secret in all places except the highest initiatic places, such as the Alexandrian catechetical school, places like this. This is an interior meditative technique. You're not ascending up into the air and going up into the clouds. You are ascending through your, what might be called your chakras, or what was known to the Hebrews as the 7 spirits that fell along the spine and so on. This was an interior meditative technique that elevated you into your highest consciousness. So what were Yeshua's traditions? Where would he have gotten this tradition from? Well, the Babylonian wisdom school, probably. It's very clear he had a very close relationship with the Babylonian traditions because of his concept of the Messiah as the Bar Enosh, the Enochian concept, and his view of the coming of the Messianic age as an incremental thing that came bit by bit through history, through the sanctification of human beings on earth, rather than an apocalyptic, or I should say, rather than an eschatological event that would come as judgment that would fall on the whole world and the world would be destroyed, as Paul and the early Christians taught. Now, why is there a difference? Well, in Galilean Pharisaism, which was Yeshua's school of thought, the idea was much closer to the Babylonian forms that were like the book of Jubilees, that over the Jubilees that the earth would be sanctified. But in Paul's tradition, which he got from Gamaliel, from the Pharisaic tradition of Judea, which was the one that Yeshua criticized, and other Galilean sages criticized as being legalistic, etc. In Paul's tradition, the Messiah was a Davidic Messiah who would come like a warrior out of the clouds, and the world would be judged, and the Messiah would judge the world, and so on. So Yeshua's tradition, probably this technique, came from the Babylonian wisdom schools. These were techniques were developed for Enochian ascent through the heavens that we find in the book of parables of the book of Enoch, and with all the messianic, Danielic, Son of Man, and Enoch, Metatron, i.e. little Yahweh, concepts that come from Babylonian archives. Probably also a connection with John the Baptist in the Qumran tradition of the Essenes, so-called Essenes, of which we know now that the Qumran caves held much more than the library of just one sect, may even have held libraries of the Christians who left Jerusalem right before the most horrible persecution that would ever happen came, the siege of Jerusalem that had been predicted by Yeshua. And using his predictions, they left the city before it was closed off and other people were trapped, and they traveled north and probably left a lot of their scriptures and even their jewelry and so on in the same caves, because that's where these were preserved, where the Romans couldn't get at them. So probably Babylonian, and probably some of the traditions associated with Qumran and John the Baptist. Again, the Enochian ascent through the Book of the Watchers and other fragments found at Qumran. So what was Yeshua's method of Merkabah ascent, which he taught as the Ratzim of the Malkuth of the Shemayim, wrongly translated as the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven in Greek? It really means the secrets, or the secret wisdom of the sovereignty of the heavens. That is the sovereignty, meaning sovereignty is like the powers and stewardships that are given to various classes and types of angels and archangels. It was this kind of sovereignty that the sages received and their disciples received, and that's what Yeshua was talking about, wrongly translated as kingdom. Well, first, there was an active visualization. There was an interior map of consciousness based on the images from Isaiah and Ezekiel, and so there was a real kind of map of consciousness, just as people would use for other forms of visualization. So it was based on visualization, imagination, and prayer, and repetition and vigiling. There are many similarities to working in a Tibetan mandala, which has very specific deities. Mandalas have very specific imagery and so on. Or in magical evocation, such as we find in the ancient magical papyri, or even in the visualizations that are used in New Thought and other kinds of things. The heavens and the angelic powers are evoked from within one's own divine zelon, or image, or what we might call microcosmic soul. So to summarize, probably based on Babylonian Enochian techniques of night heaven, SHAQAD, or vigil, with visualized ascent in a Merkabah in context of a midnight MISHQAD or vigil, as Secret Mark in the Gospel of Mary and the Ascension legends suggest. Now, in part 2 of this, we're going to look at Merkabah mysticism and apocalyptic gnosis in early Christianity, especially among the Gnostics who claim to have these secret traditions. So please click on the Patreon link in my description just below the video here in YouTube to become a patron, helping to sponsor my new videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. Thank you.